She said it like she was stating a fact, not even trying to be cruel. She was checking her phone, standing beside the hospital bed I had paid for with my own savings. I had asked if she could stay a little longer, maybe just until the morphine wore off. She sighed, glanced at her screen, and said that I'd die alone anyway. Then she tapped her heels down the hallway before I could ask what time she'd be back. I laid there for a while, staring at the rectangle of sunlight on the wall, too tired to cry. A nurse came in with warm hands and soft eyes. She smoothed the sheets without asking questions. I didn't say much that day, but I remember the way her palm brushed my shoulder, like she was saying I was still here, still seen. I'm so glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story travels. I wasn't always like this, frail, watching the world move without needing me. There was a time I was up before the sun, packing little lunches with notes tucked inside. I taught my daughter to tie her shoes, to swim, to draw perfect hearts. When her father walked out, I was the one who stayed. I worked extra shifts and came home smelling like bleach and cafeteria soup just to keep the lights on. She was a serious child, a little hard to reach, but when she hurt, she always came to me. I remember one night in her teens, she said she wished I was rich, that maybe then kids wouldn't laugh at her clothes. I told her I was giving her everything I had. I don't know if she ever believed me. It started so slowly I didn't even notice. A birthday missed. Then 2 calls answered in clipped tones. She always had somewhere to be. Husband, financial advisor, though he never looked me in the eye, started taking over things. He said it was easier for them to handle the bills, the taxes, the accounts. I was tired. I let them. Soon the house I paid off started feeling like a guest room. My favorite chair was moved to the garage. I'd find papers on the dining table with bold black headers I didn't understand. Once I walked in on them talking, my daughter said I couldn't be trusted with numbers anymore, that I was starting to forget. But I wasn't. I remember everything. I remember her saying it. My friend stopped calling. I'd ask if anyone had checked on Marjorie from the church group, and my daughter would say I was fixating again. She said rest was best. One day, I heard her telling someone on speakerphone that I was sleeping too much and didn't really want visitors. But I did. I just didn't know anyone was waiting for my invitation. She never said. After the hospital stay, a minor stroke, they called it things changed. I couldn't find my bank card. My name was off a few bills. My doctor started using terms I'd never heard. Care directives, medical proxy. I started asking for mail to be left unopened, and suddenly there was none at all. I wasn't entirely alone. There was the nurse. She'd ask me how I liked my tea. She'd bring in a flower from outside, just one stem in a glass. She never rushed. When I asked if she could check if my account still existed, she smiled carefully and said she wasn't allowed. But her look told me I wasn't imagining things. One day, when they thought I was napping, I heard her whispering on the phone with someone. She was worried. She said the daughter wasn't visiting anymore, that bills were being redirected, that I looked smaller every day, so I started checking quietly. I looked through the drawer where they kept the insurance forms. There was a folder, thick, with a label in my son-in-law's neat print. Inside were papers with my signature or something that looked like it. I don't remember signing them. One gave them control of my assets. One declared I was declining mentally. One changed the beneficiary of my estate to someone named Everbright Trust Holdings. I stared at those pages a long time. My heart didn't race. It slowed, like it was finally settling into a knowing. I didn't cry until that evening after everyone had gone. I sat on the side of the bed looking at my slippers. They were pink and worn thin. The nurse came in. She sat beside me and didn't ask questions. She held my hand. It was the only touch that day that didn't feel like obligation. That was the moment something shifted. I still had breath, and that meant I still had time. The next day, when the nurse brought me tea, I asked if she knew a good elder law attorney. She blinked, then nodded once. By the end of the week, I had a quiet meeting with a woman named Ruth, who wore sensible shoes and spoke with dignity. I told her everything. I showed her the folder. She didn't look surprised. She said we could make it right if I was willing. I was. I had one confrontation. Just one. My daughter came to check on me after the lawyer sent the first inquiry. She said I must be confused, that these things were done for my safety, that I couldn't possibly handle all the paperwork at my age. I didn't argue. I just told her I remembered the day she took my name off the bills. The afternoon she moved my sewing machine to the garage without asking. I remembered that she said I'd die alone. She blinked, but her face didn't change. It's just a slow, exhausted disappointment, like I'd embarrassed her. Then she left. It took a few months, but everything was reversed. The documents were invalid. The lawyer helped me update my will. We added a new name, the nurse. Not because I wanted revenge. Because she was the only one who saw me as I was a person. Not a burden, not a line item. A woman who still mattered. On the morning the house finally sold, I sat by the porch swing. With a cup of tea, the air smelled like jasmine. Hadn't felt that light in years. A check went to a new account I controlled. I bought a little apartment by the coast. I didn't tell anyone. I packed the last box myself. My knees ached, but I moved slow and steady. There was a photo of me and my daughter when she was 4. We were laughing. I kept it. Not because I wanted to remember her, but because I wanted to remember the part of me that laughed. I mailed the keys to the lawyer. I left no note. Just a cleaned-out house and a legal trail they couldn't touch. I still keep in touch with the nurse. She calls once a week, even though I've told her she doesn't need to. She laughs and says she knows. That's the difference. She does it anyway. There was a time she used to call me Mama, not Mom. Not Mom. Soft like a bedtime blanket. Something only she was allowed. To say I held on to that word for years after she stopped using it. It would slip into my mind sometimes when I folded old laundry or opened a drawer where I'd tucked away her drawings, little stick figures of us standing under a red sun. She always drew me with long arms. Back then, she used to say they made her feel safe. I was 23 when she was born. The doctor had just left the room, and I was still shaking from the hours of labor. They placed her on my chest, and she blinked up at me, pink and wet, like she already knew the world would ask more of her than it should. I whispered that I would never let her feel alone. I promised it out loud, even though no one else was in the room, just me and her. And that promise folded itself into my bones. Her father wasn't ready. He tried for a little while, bought a secondhand crib, fixed up the bathroom tiles, stayed late at work. But something in him never landed. I remember the night he left, he didn't pack a suitcase, just walked out the door and never came back. I sat on the edge of our bed and listened to the silence he left behind. My daughter was 2. She cried once in the night, then fell back. Asleep? I dead single quotes. It was me and her. Always her first. Picked up double shifts in the hospital cafeteria. Woke up early to iron her school uniform. She had a white sweater she loved so much I learned to stitch the holes closed in a way she wouldn't notice. I learned to braid her hair in the dark, to make grilled cheese sandwiches stretch through the week, to fold fear into a smile when the electricity bill was overdue. I made myself small so she could have a bigger world. There were good years. I won't pretend there weren't. We had Sundays in the park, movie nights with burnt popcorn, long walks when she needed to cry but didn't want to talk. I was never perfect. I snapped when I was too tired, forgot birthdays once or twice, but I always circled back. I always tried. When she got older, she changed the way teenagers do, fast and without warning. She started calling me Mom instead of Mama. She stayed in her room with the door locked, and I learned to leave plates of food outside without knocking. There were arguments about clothes, about curfews, about how I didn't understand what it was like to be her. And maybe I didn't. But I kept the light on every night until she came home. College took her far away. That was when I first felt the fracture. She visited less. Her calls got shorter. She started mentioning her boyfriend more than me. I kept reminding myself that distance was normal, That this was what growth looked like, a child stretching into her own life. I didn't expect to be her world forever. I just thought I'd still be a part of it. After graduation, she moved in with him, the man she would marry. He never warmed to me. He was polite enough at first, called me ma'am, like I was a stranger on a bus. He once said I had a tendency to repeat myself, and that maybe I should write things down more. I started second-guessing every story I told. I made myself quieter around him, thought that would help. I paid for their wedding. I dipped into the retirement savings I'd been building for decades. She never asked, but I could hear the stress in her voice when she talked about vendors and deposits, so I offered. She didn't say thank you, just texted me the wire transfer instructions. I remember sitting alone at the bank, filling out the form. The teller asked if I was sure. I said yes, I was her mother. That's what mothers do at the wedding. I wore a navy blue dress. I sat at the mother of the bride table, alone. Her new in-laws made a speech. I didn't. My name was listed in the program under family support. I tried not to let that phrase stick to my chest like a bruise. After that, things moved quickly. They bought a house. She called less. When she did call, it was to ask if I'd signed something yet, if I'd remembered a bill, if I could forward this or that. If I tried to keep up, I kept a little notebook by the phone where I wrote everything down. Dates, numbers, questions. Still, I missed things. And she started sounding tired of me. Then came the stroke. Small, the doctor said. A warning, I was lucky. But I remember lying in that hospital bed, the ceiling white and too bright, and thinking this is the beginning of the end. And I don't mean my life. I mean the version of my life where I was still needed. She came once, stood at the edge of the bed, scrolling her phone. I asked if she could sit with me for a bit. Just hold my hand like she used to when she was scared. That's when she said it. That I'd die alone anyway, as if it was already decided. I didn't argue. I didn't cry in front of her. I waited until the room was empty again. And I turned my face to the pillow so the nurse wouldn't see. The thing about betrayal from family is that it doesn't come with fireworks or loud crashes. It comes in ordinary silence, in meals eaten without you, in holidays where your chair is suddenly gone, in conversations that happen around you like you're part of the wallpaper. It's not one moment, it's thousands. It's paper cuts you don't notice until the blood is everywhere. I know now that the worst part wasn't what she did. It was that I still loved her. I still wanted her to come back. I still checked my phone every evening at 7, hoping maybe this time she'd call to say she was wrong, but she never did. And somewhere in that silence, I began to realize that I was the one who needed to change. Not for her, but for myself. There wasn't one moment that told me she was done with me. Not a slam of the door, not a letter in the mail. It happened quietly, like something dissolving, like sugar in tea, sweet at first, then just gone. After the hospital stay, I was sent home with a bottle of pills I couldn't pronounce and a thick folder of instructions I pretended to understand. My daughter dropped me off. Her husband stayed in the car with the engine running. She carried the bag in, set it by the stairs, and told me to take things easy. Then she smiled that smile she started using around me, the one that didn't reach her eyes, and she was gone. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. I walked through it like a guest. There were labels on some of the drawers now, written in her husband's handwriting. One said medication, one said bills. My recipe box was missing from the kitchen. When I asked about it, she said they'd streamlined the counters. My sewing machine had been moved to the garage, covered in a sheet. I stood staring at it for a while, hands at my sides. That machine had followed me through 4 apartments, 2 jobs, and the raising of a child. I stitched her Halloween costumes on it, her prom dress too. Now it sat next to a lawnmower and a crate of Christmas ornaments I hadn't seen in years. One afternoon, I overheard her talking to someone on the phone. I had come downstairs too quietly, I suppose. She was standing at the kitchen island speaking. Softly, she said I was starting to forget things. That I left the stove on, I hadn't. That I asked the same questions over and over. That she was looking into what next steps made sense. Her voice was low, almost soothing, like she was explaining a weather report. I stood on the other side of the wall listening, my palm pressed against the wallpaper like I could steady myself on it. That night, I looked through my drawer in the hallway console. My mail wasn't there. Just a few circulars in an old bank statement. I used to get birthday cards from Marjorie, those thick ones with glitter and long poems inside. I hadn't seen one in 2 years. I wondered if she still sent them and if they were being intercepted, that the phone rang once the next week. It was my friend Janet. We hadn't spoken in months. She said she'd called twice before, but the line just rang and rang. I told her I hadn't seen any missed calls. She paused, said she figured I'd been resting a lot. I asked her to call again soon. She said she would. She did and single quotes to the next day. I asked my daughter why the phone didn't ring anymore. She said I was just imagining things that she hadn't noticed. But later I found the ringer had been turned down to the lowest setting. I started keeping a little notebook. I wrote down what I ate, who I spoke to, what pills I took. Not because I was forgetful, but because I needed proof, in case anyone asked, in case they said again that I was slipping. I wasn't. I was remembering in secret. One morning, came into the kitchen to find her husband sitting at the table with a stack of papers. Oh. He slid one toward me and asked if I could sign it. Said it was just for record keeping, to help organize my accounts. I asked what kind of record keeping. He smiled like I was being difficult and said it was nothing complicated. I said I'd like to read it first. He hesitated. Just for a second, then gathered the papers and said he'd bring them back later. He never did. That afternoon, she told me I was being ungrateful. They were doing so much for me and I didn't seem to appreciate it. I said I hadn't asked for help. She said I wasn't in a position to manage everything on my own. I asked why she thought that. She said I didn't need to get defensive. I went back to my room, closed the door, listened to the floor creak under their steps, the quiet clink of silverware from dinner I hadn't been invited to join. They started eating without me more often. Leftovers in the fridge, no plates on the table for 3. That's when I started realizing something painful. Not just that I was being left out, but that I was being edited. Softly, steadily, they were erasing me. One day, the family photo wall in the hallway changed. A few pictures of me were gone, replaced by beach shots from their last trip. I stood in front of the wall for a long time, didn't say anything. I just stared at the empty nail where the picture of me holding her at 6 months used to hang. I still had the original in a box under my bed. I found it later that night and held it for a while. The edges were soft from years of being touched. Her cheeks were round and dimpled. My hair was wild, tied back in a scarf. We looked tired. We looked happy. I sat on the bed and stared at the picture. And I thought, maybe this is the version of us I have to keep. The one before she outgrew needing me. Before help turned into management. Before I became a woman to be handled instead of a mother to be cherished. I started sleeping with the door locked, not because I was scared, but because I wanted something, anything, to still be mine. Some nights I would lie awake and listen for sounds, the hum of their TV, the fridge door, the soft thud of footsteps overhead. And I would think, if I vanished tomorrow, would they notice? Right away. Or would they just assume I'd wandered off somewhere quiet, finally doing what they wanted, becoming invisible? That was when I knew. This wasn't about forgetting or aging or needing help. This was about control. This was about them shaping the story of me before I had finished telling it. And wasn't ready to let them hold a pen. It was subtle at first, like most things that truly hurt. It's a missed call here. A dinner I wasn't told about. It's conversations. That paused when I walked in and didn't resume. I told myself I was being sensitive. That this was what getting older looked like. That maybe people just got busy. But I've learned that isolation doesn't always come with slammed doors and sharp words. Sometimes it arrives dressed in politeness. Sometimes it wears a gentle smile while it locks you out. It started with my phone. I'd wake up to silence day after day. No messages, no calls. I remember looking at the screen, tapping it as if the brightness might coax someone into remembering me. Once I tried calling Marjorie, my oldest friend, and the line went straight to voicemail. When she finally answered 2 weeks later, her voice was careful. She said she'd called twice, left messages. I told her I hadn't gotten them. She sounded confused, then said maybe she'd try again some other time. But I could hear it in her voice. The distance. The doubt. Later that week, I checked the ringer on the house phone. It was nearly off. It's just a whisper of a chime that wouldn't have stirred me if I were standing right beside it. I turned it back up and waited. No calls came. When I asked my daughter about it, she said maybe I had turned it down by accident. Her eyes didn't meet mine when she said it. I wanted to believe her, but something inside me folded just a little more. The mail started disappearing too. I used to get flyers, birthday cards, bills, little catalogs addressed in familiar handwriting. Now the slot was empty most mornings. One day I asked if we were getting less mail. My daughter told me everything was digital these days, she said. There wasn't much worth opening, but it was easier if she kept track of it. Easier for who? I started checking the hallway table early, before she got to it. Sometimes there would be an envelope quickly taken away the next time I turned my back. Once I saw a thick packet with my name and a return address from a hospital I didn't recognize. Never saw it again. When I asked about my own medical appointments, she said she was handling them. That everything was coordinated through her now. That it was just simpler that way. I asked what medications I was on. She said nothing had changed. But when I looked at the pill organizer one day, the compartments were different. More pills, unfamiliar shapes. I couldn't read the labels without my glasses. My glasses had gone missing 2 days before. The more I asked, the more I was told I was confused, tired, overwhelmed, that I should rest more, that I shouldn't worry, that they were taking care of everything I didn't feel taken care of. I felt managed, monitored, positioned like furniture, something to be dealt with, not listened to. Even the small routines began to fade. They used to ask if I wanted tea in the afternoon. Now I'd find the kettle cold and the cups already washed. Dinner would happen while I was upstairs. Once I came down and found the table cleared, the dishwasher running, and my daughter sitting on the couch with a bowl in her lap. She looked up and said, "They didn't think I'd be hungry." No one asked me anymore. I stopped being included in weekend plans. There were barbecues I wasn't invited to, grandchild visits that never included me. One afternoon, I heard laughter in the backyard. I looked out and saw my daughter's family gathered around a folding table, plates full of food, music playing from a speaker. I hadn't even known they were home. When I asked why I hadn't been told, she said she thought I'd want to rest, that she didn't want to tire me out, that I needed quiet these days. But it wasn't quiet I needed. It was connection, conversation, a seat at the table. And still, I tried to be understanding. I told myself she was overwhelmed, that her husband was the one orchestrating this distance and she was just caught in it. I reminded myself of her childhood, how soft her voice used to get when she was scared. How she once told me she couldn't fall asleep unless I hummed near her door. I clung to that memory like a rope in the dark. But even ropes fray. The nurse came once a week to check my vitals. She was the only one who asked me how I was doing and actually waited for an answer. She had warm eyes and a quiet way of placing her hand on my wrist when she spoke. One morning, she lingered a little longer than usual. She said I looked thinner, that my energy was low. I nodded and looked away. She asked if anyone was helping me eat. I said they were busy. She didn't comment, but her silence held more truth than any words had in months. A few days later, I tried to call the pharmacy myself to ask about a prescription. The number didn't work. When I asked why, my daughter said they'd changed providers, that she'd take care of it, that I didn't need to make calls like that anymore. I started to feel like a ghost in my own life, like I was floating from room to room, seen only when convenient. My opinions were ignored, my routines rewritten, my choices taken from me one by one. And the more I tried to push back, the more I was told to rest, to stop worrying, to let go. I began to wonder if they were waiting for me to disappear entirely. Not from malice, not even from cruelty, but from a quiet belief that I had already done what I was here to do. That my usefulness had expired. And that's the most painful part of all. Being treated like love has an expiration date. But I wasn't gone yet. And somewhere inside that soft ache, a seed of clarity began to grow. They may have isolated me, but I still remembered who I was. And I wasn't finished speaking. It was a Tuesday when the truth started to slide out from the cracks. That's how most truths begin. Not with a crash, but with something crooked shifting beneath your feet. Something small enough that it can be ignored if you want to. I didn't want to ignore it anymore. The morning had started like any other. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold before I touched it. The light was soft through the blinds, but everything felt dim. I remember the sound of the clock ticking above the pantry, steady, like it was counting something. I hadn't given it permission to. My daughter was upstairs. Her husband had left early, muttering something about a meeting and slamming the door hard enough to rattle the keys in the bowl by the entryway. I sat there alone, the tea untouched, and listened to the silence settle over the house like dust. I don't know why I got up. Maybe the quiet became too heavy. Maybe some small, stubborn part of me had finally had enough. But I stood, walked into the hallway, and opened the drawer where I used to keep the mail. It was nearly empty. It's just a few flyers and a coupon booklet from a grocery store I hadn't been to in years. And then I saw it, a pale blue envelope. Thick, uncreased, with my name printed in neat block letters. Not a sticker, not typed, written. Someone had taken the time to write my name with a pen. My first instinct was confusion. The second was something closer to dread. I opened it slowly, my fingers trembling. Inside was a document I didn't understand. At first, a letter from an insurance company I didn't recognize, confirming receipt of a change of beneficiary request for a policy I hadn't realized still existed. I sat down at the kitchen table. Read it again. My eyes weren't as sharp as they used to be, but the meaning was clear enough. My name had been removed from something, and someone else's had been added. The name was a trust, a string of generic legal words that sounded like a shell. It wasn't the first time I'd felt something was wrong. It was just the first time I had the proof in my hands. I tucked the envelope into the waistband of my robe, walked quietly back to my room, and locked the door. That night, I waited until the house was asleep. I pulled the box from under my bed, the one I hadn't touched in months. It held all the old documents I'd gathered through the years. Tax returns, bank statements, insurance policies. Lipped through the pages slowly, whispering the years to myself like prayer beads. There, buried between folders from 20 years ago, I found the original copy of that same insurance policy. My name, clear as daylight, had been listed as the owner and beneficiary. I set both papers side by side and just stared at them. I hadn't signed any change, I hadn't authorized anything, and yet the change had gone through. The next morning, I asked my daughter if we could talk. She didn't look up from her phone. I said I had found something strange in the mail. She raised an eyebrow and asked why I'd been going through the mail at all. Not what it meant, not whether I was okay. Just why had I looked? I held up the envelope. She glanced at it for less than a second and said she'd take care of it, that it was probably a clerical error. I asked her what the trust name meant. She said it was nothing to worry about. Said they were simplifying things, making sure I was protected. That word again, protected, as if I were some fragile thing they'd placed behind glass. I didn't say anything else. I just nodded and tucked the envelope into my pocket again, knowing full well I wouldn't see it again if I left it out of my sight. Later that day, I heard her talking to her husband on the phone. I hadn't meant to listen, but their voices were raised and careless. She said I was starting to ask questions, that maybe they'd acted too soon, that they needed to be more careful. I stood on the other side of the stairwell, my hand against the banister, breathing as quietly as I could. My throat felt like it had closed up, like something sharp and dry was lodged in it. She had acted too soon. They were planning something, and had finally stepped far enough outside of their script to notice. The nurse came later that week. She could tell I was quieter than usual. She asked me if I'd been eating. I told her I was trying. She asked if I'd been sleeping. I said enough. Then, as she was writing in her folder, I asked her if she'd ever heard of the name on the trust, Everbright. Her eyes lifted for just a moment. She said yes. That it was one of those corporate umbrellas people used for asset transitions. Her tone was careful. She didn't want to overstep. I asked her what someone might use a trust like that for. In plain terms, she hesitated, then said, control. That's what those structures were for. Control of money, of decisions, of property. I didn't say anything more. I didn't need to. She closed the folder gently and rested her hand on mine. Later, when she left, I sat in my room with the door closed, the envelope in my lap, and I whispered the truth out loud, just once, just to myself. They were making decisions without me, about me, because they believed. I couldn't stop them. They were wrong. I still remembered how to fight quietly. I still knew how to protect myself. I had been doing it since the day I became a mother, and now I would do it again, for me. The day I began looking closely, really looking. It's the day I stopped asking for their permission. There's something strange that happens when you've been dismissed for long enough. You start to believe your instincts are unreliable, that the second guessing is just aging, that the doubt belongs to you and not to the people who planted it in you. I carried that doubt like a coat for a long time, but coats can be shed. After the envelope, I gave myself a task every day. Small things. Nothing grand or suspicious. I didn't want them to notice the shift in me too soon. Started waking earlier while the house was still quiet. I'd move slowly, deliberately, so as not to creak the floorboards. And I'd check the places I'd stopped believing I had access to. The file cabinet in the upstairs office, the one her husband always kept locked, wasn't locked one morning. Carelessness on his part or arrogance. Either way, I stood before it barefoot in the dawn, heart racing like I was a thief in my own house. Inside, there were folders marked with labels I recognized, bank names, insurance companies, even the name of the firm that had handled my will years ago. That one stopped me. I opened it carefully. Inside were two wills. One older. The one I remembered signing at the lawyer's office downtown back when my daughter was still in her early 30s. It left everything to her. There was a note in my handwriting, paper clipped to the front for Anna. Love, always. That hurt to look at. Behind it was another version, newer, printed neatly, more formal. It's my signature at the bottom, but not. In my hand, I leaned in close. My hands began to shake. The signature was close, but I knew the truth of my own name. This one looked traced. I touched the ink with my fingertip as if touching it would undo it. It had different terms. The new will split my estate between something called Everbright Living Solutions and a second entity with a cold name, a financial manager I'd never met. Not Anna, not even a person. My life boxed and categorized, handed to companies without faces. I took a photo of each page with the phone I had kept hidden in the bottom drawer of my nightstand. It was old, a prepaid one, but it still worked. I had recharged it quietly one afternoon when they were out. I didn't trust their cloud backups. Phone stayed with me, off and hidden. The next day, I checked the mailbox again before my daughter came down. I found a bank statement, opened, then taped shut poorly. It was from an account I didn't even remember opening. listing large transfers I didn't authorize. Money moved into what looked like a shared management fund. Again, the same name, Everbright. It was everywhere. I copied the numbers into my notebook, the little blue one I kept under the cushion of the chair by the window. I wrote slowly, carefully. The pages were starting to look like a spider web. Connections, dates, balances. Every day I added something more. I was building a story. My story. One that no one else would write for me. That Sunday, I waited until they left for brunch. I wasn't invited. My daughter said I needed rest. She'd taken to saying that more lately, like it was a permission slip to be excluded. With the house empty, I went to the garage. I hadn't been out there since they'd moved my sewing machine. I pulled the sheet off it slowly, and behind it I found a plastic bin. It had my name written in faded marker. Inside were old documents, my tax returns, old deeds, and, strangely, a letter from my first bank, the one I'd opened when I was 25. It's the one I thought had been closed years ago. The letter was recent. It confirmed a request to deactivate access to my online account and listed a phone number for the authorized party on file. The name listed wasn't mine. I felt something in my chest go cold. Not panic, not grief. It was quieter than that. A kind of resignation. It's the kind that comes after too many quiet betrayals. Like water finally wearing down stone, I sat on the low step of the garage, the letter in my lap. And I stared at the gray light leaking in under the door. They weren't just making decisions without me. They were removing me, quietly, methodically. From my accounts, my legal rights, my story. I took the letter back to my room, made another copy in the notebook. Then I turned the phone on and dialed the number of the lawyer. The nurse had whispered to me weeks ago. Ruth, her assistant, answered. She spoke kindly, listened carefully. I gave only my first name and said I had a few questions. She didn't ask more. She set up a time that evening when they came home. I sat at the kitchen table while they laughed in the living room. I folded my hands, waited. I didn't bring it up. Not yet. I was learning to move like they did, quietly but deliberately. I wasn't confused. I wasn't tired. I was finally wide awake. And the more I uncovered, the more I realized they had underestimated me. The woman who worked 2 jobs and raised a child alone. The woman who saved every spare dollar, who taught herself how to fix a faucet. Who once hand-stitched a dress from newspaper patterns. When money was too tight for fabric, they thought they could unwrite me. But I had always known how to thread a needle. And now I was stitching together the seams of a truth they didn't think I'd ever find. I didn't sleep the night before I met with the lawyer. Sat by the window, wrapped in the old green shawl my mother had knitted when I was pregnant with Anna. It still smelled faintly of cedar from a storage chest long ago. I held that shawl tight around my shoulders as if it might hold me together. The house was dark, silent, except for the creak of old wood and the distant hum of the refrigerator. I had a strange thought then that the fridge knew more about my life these past months than anyone else. It had been witness to all the things I hadn't been allowed to say. At 9:45 the next morning, I asked the nurse if she could take me to an appointment. She didn't ask questions. She arrived in a quiet car, windows rolled down, air smelling like citrus and clean fabric. She helped me into the front seat as if it were nothing, but her hand lingered on mine for just a second longer than necessary. I didn't speak much during the ride. She didn't press. The lawyer's office was in an old brick building downtown. Narrow staircase, quiet hall. When Ruth stepped into the room, I recognized her immediately, the kind of woman who knows how to wait. Sensible shoes, gray suit, nothing flashy. She offered me water, and when I said no, she nodded and sat down without making it awkward. That's what I needed, not sympathy. Just a place to put the truth down without having it repackaged. I handed her the folder I'd built. The copies, the names, my notebook. She took her time reading. No expression, just a careful concentration. When she finally looked up, she said very calmly that I wasn't wrong, not mistaken, not forgetful. not confused. She said I had every right to be concerned and every legal right to take back what had been taken. Then she told me what I already knew but had not yet allowed myself to believe. Someone had forged my signature. Someone had altered my financial records. Someone had transferred power of attorney under false pretenses and rerouted my estate into cold, invisible hands. Someone had decided I didn't need to know. I sat still. I felt no triumph, no rush of fury, just stillness. Like the truth had settled in my bones and made itself comfortable. She asked if I wanted to pursue legal action. I nodded. She asked if I felt safe. That one took longer. Eventually, I said yes. Not because I truly felt safe, but because I knew I would. Soon, Ruth gave me a folder of my own, filled with words like revocation and cease and desist. She said we'd start with quiet steps, paper steps. She said sometimes a letter carries more weight than a shout. On the way home, I kept the folder in my lap. The nurse didn't ask what was inside. She just turned the radio on low and hummed along to an old song I used to sing in the kitchen when Anna was small. I almost asked her if she had children, but I didn't. There was something sacred about the silence between us. That evening, I made dinner for myself, something simple, just lentils and rice. No one noticed. No one asked where I'd been. My daughter passed me in the hallway and said something about the heat. Her husband didn't look up from his laptop. I sat at the table alone, as I often did, and ate slowly, tasting each bite like it was proof I was still here. The next day, the letter arrived. Ruth had sent it by courier. It was addressed to Anna and her husband. Thick envelope, heavy paper. I placed it on the counter where they always left my mail, and I waited. She found it first. I heard the tear of the seal, the rustle of pages, the long, slow pause of reading something you hadn't expected. Then came her voice, sharper than I'd heard in months. She called my name. I didn't answer right away. I let her call it again. Then I stepped into the living room she held. The letter like it was burning her fingers. She asked if I understood what I'd done. Said yes. She asked if I was feeling well. I said I was. She looked at her husband. He didn't speak, just stared at the letter, then at me. There was something in his eyes I couldn't name. Not fear, not guilt, something colder. Calculation. Maybe she said I didn't need to involve outsiders. That we could talk, work things out. I said I'd tried that already. I told her I had no interest in punishing anyone. I just wanted my life back, she scoffed. Said I was overreacting, that she'd only been trying to help. I didn't argue. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and said softly, carefully, that help isn't help if you erase someone to give it. She went quiet then. The silence was long, uncomfortable. Then she left the room. Her husband followed. I stood there, heart steady. The letter still lay on the table. In that moment, I felt something shift. Not in the air, in me. I wasn't hiding anymore. Later that night, I sat on the edge of my bed with the folder Ruth had given me. I flipped through the pages slowly, one by one. Each sheet felt like a stitch being undone from the net they'd tried to trap me in. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel powerless. I felt prepared. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of the part where I wrote my own name clearly, legibly, in my own hand, where no one could erase it again. It's strange what freedom feels like when it first arrives. It doesn't come with a trumpet or a flag, doesn't knock, doesn't even clear its throat. It just appears quietly in your chest. Like a room you didn't know you had has been unlocked. The morning after the letter was read, I woke early. The sky outside was still soft, not yet day, not still night. That in-between hour where the world exhales. I pulled back the curtains and opened the window just enough to hear the wind in the trees. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the breeze settle across my arms. I thought, I'm not scared anymore. It wasn't joy I felt. I wasn't anger either. It was something simpler, cleaner. like I had rinsed off the fog they'd poured over me. Bit by bit, all those months, I made my own breakfast. Toasted bread, a hard-boiled egg, a sliced pear. I set the table for one and placed the good linen napkin next to the plate. Not for them, for me, because I was still here, because I mattered. When my daughter came down, she didn't speak. Just poured her coffee with her back to me. Her shoulders were stiff. I watched her wait for me to say something, anything that would let her believe this could go back to what it was. But I didn't offer that. I wouldn't. She turned once. Tried to smile, but it was hollow. She asked how I was feeling. I said I was feeling fine. She nodded like she didn't believe me. But belief was no longer her currency in this house. Truth was, I went for a walk after breakfast. It's first time in weeks. I walked down the block to where the sidewalk cracked beneath the old magnolia tree, the one I used to photograph every spring. I stood there, hand resting on the trunk, and I remembered taking Anna there as a girl, how she'd stuff her pockets with fallen petals and ask if the tree could hear her when she sang. I almost smiled. Almost the neighborhood hadn't changed much. Still the same mailboxes, the same garden gnomes. But I had changed. Something in me had turned a corner. Felt it in the way I walked. Slower, steadier. Not out of weakness, but choice. I wasn't rushing back to their silence anymore. I was claiming my own noise, even if it was quiet. Back at the house, the atmosphere was brittle. My daughter was on the phone in the living room, her voice low and clipped. I heard her say my name. I heard the word lawyer. Then her voice dropped, and I didn't hear the rest. But I didn't need to. They were scrambling. They had never expected me to stand. They'd built an entire version of me based on who I was at my most tired, when I was sick, when I needed help, when I was quiet out of exhaustion and not consent. They thought that was the real me. They thought they could freeze me there. They forgot I had raised a child alone, paid off a mortgage, laughed after funerals. I had learned strength not through choice, but through necessity. And now that strength had returned, not as a roar, but as resolve. That night I went through my closet. I pulled out every dress, every coat, every shoe that no longer fit the woman I was now. I made piles, donations, keep toss. It's a process. Felt symbolic. Every item I let go of was a version of me that had waited too long, swallowed too much. Made herself smaller to fit into someone else's comfort in the bottom drawer. Under old scarves and outgrown sweaters, I found a tin box. Inside it were photographs, old ones. Anna as a baby, toothless and wide-eyed, her first bike. A drawing she made in 3rd grade of me as a superhero. A card she had made one Mother's Day with construction paper and misspelled words. You are my safe. I sat on the floor with that box in my lap and cried, not because I wanted her back, but because I finally stopped needing her to return as the girl who made that card. I was no longer trying to fix what she'd chosen to break. The next morning, I called the nurse. I asked if she could stop by, not for an appointment, just for tea. She arrived with a small box of pastries and no questions. We sat on the back porch where the sunlight filtered through the lattice just right. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. She looked at me and said, "You look different, lighter." I said, "I feel like I finally stood up from a chair I didn't realize I was tied to." She smiled. That was enough. Later that week, Ruth called. The paperwork was moving. The forged will was being challenged. The accounts were frozen until the investigation was complete. I thanked her. She said I had nothing to thank her for, that it was my courage that made her job possible. That night I wrote a letter. To myself, I wrote everything I had forgotten, that I am still capable, that I am still worthy of a voice, of peace, of protection. I folded it and slipped it under my pillow. The next morning I woke with clarity. The kind that doesn't buzz or ache. The kind that hums gently, like the soft turn of a key in a lock that has rusted but not broken. They may have tried to rewrite me, but I was still the author, and the next chapter would be mine. The confrontation wasn't loud. Didn't happen. at a family dinner or across a courtroom or with someone pounding their fists. It came one afternoon in the kitchen. Sunlight stretched across the tile. The scent of rosemary from the roast they forgot I didn't eat anymore. She was standing by the sink, rinsing a glass, her back to me. I had just returned from another meeting with Ruth. We'd signed more papers, a formal revocation of the false power of attorney, a reinstatement of my control over the accounts. Quiet, heavy steps in the right direction. I stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. The way her shoulders tensed when she realized I hadn't gone straight to my room. She didn't turn around, but I saw her hand pause under the faucet. I said her name gently. Not cold, not angry, just level. She looked over her shoulder, one eye meeting mine. "We should talk," I said. She dried her hand slowly and pulled out a chair at the table like she was bracing for something. Sat across from her. My hands stayed folded in my lap. I asked her very simply, why? Her eyes shifted. She reached for the usual explanations first. Concern, safety, convenience. That they'd only done what they thought was best for me. That it was all temporary. That I had been confused after the stroke. That maybe I'd forgotten, and that was okay. I didn't let her finish the sentence. I told her I remembered everything. The missing mail. The faint ring of the phone turned to silence. The forged signature. The documents I never saw. The account I didn't open. I told her I had copies, witnesses that. Ruth had already begun the process of restoring everything. She blinked, once, then said softly, as if hoping the air would swallow her words, that I was overreacting. I asked her if she remembered saying, I would die alone. She didn't answer. I asked her if she believed it, really believed it, or if she had just wanted me to feel small enough to hand it all over. Still, no answer. I sat there with the silence between us, and I let it stretch. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of silence. I told her I wasn't angry. That's what surprised her most, I think. She kept waiting for me to raise my voice, to sob, to demand apologies. But I didn't want apologies anymore. Wanted distance, truth, clarity. She said she'd been overwhelmed, that her husband had handled most of the paperwork, that she hadn't known everything. That part I almost believed. Not because it made her innocent, but because it made her passive, which hurt even more. I reminded her that passivity is still a choice. That silence can be complicity. That erasure doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it just looks like someone walking past your open door and pretending not to see you. She asked what would happen now. I said I wasn't sure, but that I would no longer be living here. Under false peace. She looked down at her hands and, for a moment, thought I saw the girl she used to be, the one who used to color me. Birthday cards with glitter glue, and write me notes that said, "You're the strongest woman I know." I felt sorry for her in a way, because somewhere along the line she had started mistaking control for love. And that belief had stolen something from both of us. She asked if I hated her. I told her I didn't, but I also told her I didn't trust. Her and I wouldn't again. Not in the way she wanted. She began to cry, quietly, like a leak in the hull of a boat. Slow, steady, inevitable. I sat with her until the sobs softened. Then I stood, before I left the room. I turned back and said something I hadn't planned. I told her that love isn't a trap. It isn't supposed to shrink a person into obedience. It's supposed to protect, not possess. And then I left her there, surrounded by her decisions. Upstairs, I began to pack a small suitcase. I didn't need much. Just the essentials. Documents, clothes, my mother's shawl. My notebook. The nurse had offered a place to stay for a few nights, not out of pity, but respect. And I had accepted. Later that evening, her husband returned. He didn't speak. To me, he passed me in the hallway like I was the shadow of someone no longer useful, but I had already expected that. He had made his choice long ago. The next morning, I set the keys to the house on the kitchen counter. Not because I was giving up my rights, but because I was reclaiming my peace. I didn't need a house that didn't feel like home. I needed air, light, movement. The nurse arrived just after sunrise. She helped me carry the suitcase, didn't ask questions, just opened the door and waited. As we stepped outside, I took one last look at the porch swing. It's the one where I used to sit with Anna when she was small, her feet not yet reaching the ground, her hair full of sunlight. I let the image sit in my chest. Then I let it go. No ceremony, no final words. Just the soft sound of my steps moving toward freedom. That was my confrontation. Not in court, not with anger, but with truth, with calm, with the quiet knowing that dignity is louder than rage when spoken plainly. And as the door closed behind me, I felt the first full breath I'd taken in years rise and fall in my chest like a tide, gentle but powerful, returning me to myself. The nurse's guest room was small, but it was clean and warm, and the window faced east. The morning after I moved in, I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the light spill onto the wooden floor like gold. I wrapped my shawl tighter around my shoulders and whispered, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, just to the moment. For existing, there was no clock in that room, just the slow rhythm of birdsong and wind. I didn't miss the sound of raised voices. I didn't miss the heavy quiet that had settled over that house like fog. I missed what I thought family was. Supposed to be, but not what mine had become. The nurse, whose name I'll leave out to protect her privacy, never hovered. She gave me space. She let me keep my silences. But every morning, there was a cup of tea already steeping by the time I came down. A plate with 2 slices of toast and jam. She never asked how I was sleeping or if I wanted to talk, but I knew. I could if I needed to. That was the kind of help I had forgotten existed. It's the kind that didn't come with a ledger or an agenda. Ruth called 2 days after I left the house. She asked how I was feeling. I said I was tired but clear. That was a good place to be. She'd spoken with a forensic document examiner who was reviewing the signatures. The evidence was already enough to halt all activity on the fraudulent will. That was the first step. The rest would take time. I told her I wasn't in a rush. That I had lived under their version of me for long enough. I could be patient now that I was back in my own skin. I began to rebuild the parts of my life they'd chipped away. I started with the practical. I met with a financial advisor. Ruth recommended a man in his 60s with a soft voice and no condescension in his eyes. He listened. He asked questions gently. He helped me open a new account in my name only. He explained how to monitor. If he showed me how to set alerts for any changes. The second ally I gathered was a notary, who helped me draft a letter to formally revoke any previous powers of attorney. We filed it with the state. We sent copies to every institution that had ever received a forged document. The third ally was more unexpected. Janet. She showed up one afternoon on the porch, holding a small bundle of tulips and a look of cautious hope. I hadn't seen her since before the stroke. I asked how she found me. She said she'd called the house and my daughter told her I'd gone somewhere to rest. That had raised enough suspicion for her to keep looking. She'd asked Marjorie. And Marjorie had known enough to point her here. We sat together for hours that day, mostly quiet. At one point, I told her everything, not with drama, just with honesty. Her eyes brimmed, but she didn't interrupt. When I finished, she said softly, "You didn't imagine it." And that meant more than I knew how to say. The fourth ally came in the form of a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in years. Mrs. Darnell. She left a voicemail one evening after hearing through Janet that I'd left. She said she'd noticed strange men coming in and out of my house in the past months, supposedly to appraise things. She offered to give a statement if I needed one. I sat with that message on repeat. Even the walls had seen what I'd been forced to doubt in myself. Each of these women, Ruth, the nurse, Janet, Mrs. Darnell, helped anchor me. Not as saviors, not as heroes, but as witnesses. And there is nothing more powerful than being witnessed when you've spent months being erased, One morning, I went to the post office with Ruth's assistant to file a forwarding address. I stood in line behind a mother with 2 children and a man mailing a stack of bills. When it was my turn, the woman behind the counter asked for my ID and address. I handed her my new information, my new address, my new chapter. She looked up and smiled. New place. I nodded. Fresh start. I smiled back. Something like that. By the end of the week, the legal process was fully in motion. The forged documents were being challenged. The lawyer had filed to reinstate my original will and revoke the trust that had swallowed everything I owned. The financial advisor assured me my assets were protected now. The notary sent me a final version of all the revocations, signed. Then, with my real name in my real hand, I kept copies of everything in a red accordion folder I bought from a stationery store 2 blocks from the nurse's place. I labeled each tab. I wasn't going to let anyone else file me away again. One evening, I sat with the nurse on her back porch. We watched the sky darken. She asked what I planned to do next. I told her the truth. I didn't know yet, but I knew what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't go back, not just to the house, but to the version of myself I had been while living there, waiting, shrinking, whispering around other people's needs. I wasn't a dependent. I wasn't fading. I wasn't gone. I had been betrayed, yes, but I had also remembered myself, and with every signature, every conversation, every gentle hand that reached out to meet mine without force, I was stitching myself whole again. Though allies I had gathered didn't rescue me. They simply reminded me that I had never been lost, only buried. Briefly, under the dust of someone else's intentions. I didn't choose the setting. It chose me. It happened in a doctor's office, not a courtroom, not a family table, not a dramatic hallway with the wind howling through the curtains. It's just a beige waiting room with a bowl of tired mints and a fake ficus in the corner. But it was the right place. It was quiet, was plain, and everything in it echoed exactly how stripped down this moment needed to be. I had scheduled the appointment weeks ago, my follow-up with the neurologist. Just a routine check after the stroke. But when I called to confirm, the receptionist mentioned something odd, that my daughter had already filled out new intake forms, that she'd submitted updated medical directives, that, according to their system, she was still listed as my medical proxy. I sat on the end of my bed after that call, holding the receiver in my lap like it had said something personal. I had already revoked that proxy. I had the documents, had filed them, certified, and stamped. But somehow, my daughter had made her way back into the system, and I was tired of things happening behind my back. So I called Ruth. I called the doctor's office again. I asked for a formal meeting to clarify my status. I asked if my daughter and her husband could attend, not because I wanted them there, but because I needed this moment to exist in the open where no one could twist it later. When I arrived, I wore gray slacks, a cardigan, and a string of pearls I hadn't worn in years. They had been a gift from my mother on my 40th birthday. I used to think they were too formal for everyday wear. But now I understood there is nothing more formal than reclaiming your life. The nurse took my vitals. Steady, my blood pressure was calm. The only thing that ticked was the clock behind her. That, too, I welcomed. Let time watch me take this back. My daughter and her husband arrived late. They walked in like they were being summoned to a misunderstanding. Backs straight, eyes scanning for witnesses. She looked tired, he looked annoyed. I looked whole. The doctor was kind but brisk. A woman my age with good posture and a folder she didn't glance at until we were all seated. I cleared my throat. I said I'd like to begin. They waited for the doctor to speak. But I did first. I told her that I was aware of my diagnosis, my condition, my medication, all of it. That I was capable of making my own decisions. That I had legal documentation proving my competence. That my proxy had been changed. That my estate was no longer under my daughter's control. And that while I welcomed their concern, I would no longer be managed like an account someone forgot to close. I handed the doctor the documents, clean copies, notarized, labeled. Ruth had prepared them in a red envelope, the same color as the folder where I now kept my life. The doctor took them, read the top sheet, and nodded. She turned to my daughter and said calmly, "These are valid. We'll update the system." My daughter opened her mouth to speak, but I raised my hand gently. "Let me finish," I said. Then I turned toward her, toward both of them. I told them that I had loved them more than they ever knew, that I had given pieces of myself I could never get back, that I had built my life around their well-being, and that I never expected perfection, only honesty. I said the betrayal hadn't just been financial, it had been human. They had taken my name off things I had spent a lifetime building. They had rewritten my story without asking me what chapter 1 was in. They had made decisions for me, not with me, and worse, they had justified it all in the name of care. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. He didn't look at me, just kept his arms folded. I told them this wasn't about revenge. I wasn't here to humiliate them. I was here to draw a line firm and final. They no longer spoke for me. They no longer handled my affairs. They no longer held any legal or financial claim to my life. The doctor nodded again. Said it was clear, said the record would reflect all changes. My daughter whispered quietly that she was only trying to help. I looked at her, then really looked. Her eyes looked older than I remembered, her face thinner. She had changed, too, in all this. Maybe some part of her did think it was love, but it had become control. And control, even in the language of love, is still a cage. I told her she didn't need to try anymore, that she could rest, that I was choosing to live on my own terms now, that I wished her peace, but not proximity. Her husband stood first, said they were done here. I stayed seated. I watched them walk out. And when the door closed behind them, the air in the room felt real again. The doctor reached across the desk, placed her hand gently on mine, and said, "I hope more people your age do what you've done." I smiled. No, what I did wasn't brave. It was necessary, because no one should have to prove they're still a person, especially not to the people they raised. That afternoon, I walked out of the clinic with no shadow behind me. Just a folder in my purse, a nurse waiting outside in the car, and the clear, steady rhythm of my own 2 feet walking toward the rest of my life. I didn't look back, not at the building, not at the parking lot, not at the version of me they left behind in the file cabinets of their assumptions, because that version didn't exist anymore. She had stood up, she had spoken, she had survived the first morning in my new apartment. I stood barefoot in the center of the living room and let the quiet settle around me like a second skin. No footsteps upstairs, no locked cabinets, no voices through walls whispering my name, like a problem to be solved. Just the sound of a kettle whistling and a window open to the breeze. The apartment wasn't grand. 2 rooms and a balcony, with floors that creaked and wallpaper that curled in one corner, but it was mine. The lease was in my name. The rent was paid from my own account. The key sat heavy and right in the palm of my hand. That mattered more than square footage ever could. There was a small pine table by the window. I'd found it secondhand, and when I touched its surface the first time, I felt something solid in it, something unvarnished and real. I placed it in the corner where the sun reached each morning, and that became my writing table, my tea table, my place to sit with thee. The nurse helped me move in. She brought boxes of linens and an old tea kettle from her own kitchen. We unpacked slowly, without rush. She didn't try to arrange things for me. She asked where I wanted things. That small difference meant everything once she left. I hung one picture on the wall, just one. It was a photo of me and Anna years ago, in a field somewhere on the way to a cousin's wedding. She had daisies in her hair and I was laughing, my hand mid-air like I was trying to keep time with something unspoken. I didn't hang it to remember her. I hung it to remember me, the version of me who hadn't been afraid yet. Who still reached for joy without asking if it was allowed. Later that evening, I lit a candle, lavender, a simple flame on the counter. I sat on the small couch with my legs tucked beneath me and looked around the room, not for what was missing, but for what was finally present. I had space. I had time. I had the breath to make up life again. And that was no small thing. One of the first things I did in the new apartment was write a new will. Ruth helped me draft it. We sat together at her office, her pen gliding across paper with the same steadiness I had come to trust. I asked that the nurse, the one who had held my hand without condition, be included. Not because I owed her, but because she never treated me like a woman with anything to give. She treated me like a woman who still mattered. The rest of my estate, what was left of it, would go to a scholarship fund. One for older women returning to school, starting over, choosing themselves. After decades of being everything to everyone else, I called it the Wildflower Grant. For the ones who bloom later, slower, but stronger. When I told Ruth the name, she smiled, said it fit. I also updated my emergency contact forms, my medical directives, my preferences for end-of-life care. Everything down to the music I wanted playing when my time came. Not because I feared death, because I had learned what it looked like for people to decide things in your absence, and would never leave my story in someone else's mouth. Again, that week I bought a small plant, rosemary, in a clay pot. It sat on the windowsill and reminded me to care for something outside of myself again. Each morning I watered it, and each evening I whispered to it, "Thank you for growing here." Even after everything, I began to walk again, to just a few blocks each day. Past the old bakery that closed too early, past the bench where teenagers talked too loudly. No one knew me there. No one watched me for signs of slipping. No one asked if I'd taken my pills or if I remembered my address. I remembered everything. The nurse visited once a week, bringing small things, magazines, fresh pears, a crocheted coaster she thought I'd like. I didn't tell her how often I used that coaster. How I placed my tea on it every morning like it was a ritual of gratitude. One afternoon, she brought a notebook. Said maybe I'd like to write things down, not for anyone else, just for me. I opened it that evening and wrote, "I am not gone. I am becoming again." And that's where the entries began. Each day I added a memory I chose to keep. Not the ones forced on me, not the ones twisted or stolen. It's the ones I reached for willingly. It's the ones I reclaimed. One page was just the smell of lemon dish soap on my mother's hands. Another was the sound of Anna laughing on a swing. Another was the creak of the floor by my bed in the house I left behind. Not as a wound, that as a fact. Facts make peace easier than fiction, and I was finally choosing peace. Sometimes I still thought of Anna, not with rage, not even with grief. With distance, with a kind of soft sadness for what might have been, if she had remembered who I was before she tried to turn me into something easier to handle. But I didn't wait for an apology. Freedom doesn't need permission. One morning, I looked out the balcony window and saw a woman my age walking her dog. She waved. I waved back. The simplicity of it broke something open in me. I wasn't being watched. I was being seen. And that's what freedom is. Not escape, but return to yourself. To your quiet. To the sacred ground of your own name. That night, I sat at my table by the window, candle flickering low. And I whispered the words again. "Thank you for growing here." Even after everything, there are things I used to carry that I no longer keep close. Guilt, shame for needing too much. Regret for not asking sooner, for not speaking louder. They've quieted now, not vanished. Not forgotten, but softened into lessons. They sit in me like worn stones at the bottom of a stream, rounded by time, no longer sharp enough to cut. When I walk through the apartment now, I see myself. In every shelf I arranged without commentary. In the chipped blue mug I chose from a thrift shop because it reminded me of one I had when Anna was a child. In the way I hum without fear of being overheard or judged, in the unlocked door, in the slow coffee. In the pair of shoes by the mat, the only pair, mine alone. Freedom is not loud. It's not dramatic. It's not some grand act of revenge with music swelling behind it. It's the quiet fact of your own breath uninterrupted. I am not building a new life from scratch. I am returning to the one they tried to steal from under me, one boundary at a time, one signature at a time, one assumption at a time. They didn't succeed. And I don't say that from triumph. I say it from a place of stillness. It's like someone who was buried shallow and dug herself out inch by inch. Not with fury, but with remembering. I've stopped hoping my daughter will come back different. That hope lived in me for too long, and it made me small. Now I let her exist where she is, distant, defensive, and quiet in her own choices. She hasn't called. Not since the meeting with the doctor. Not since I left the house. Not since the trust was dissolved and the accounts were restored and the false signatures were officially recorded as what they were: fraud, misrepresentation, a betrayal written in ink. That silence used to feel like an open wound. Now it feels like a door closed gently. She didn't reach for me. I no longer reach back. I do not need her voice to narrate who I am anymore. I still look at that photo sometimes. The one on the wall of us in the field. I don't cry when I see it now. I just breathe through it. That version of her, the child with daisies in her hair, lives in memory. But she doesn't belong to me. Not anymore. She's part of my past, and I no longer ask the past to speak kindly to me. That's something the nurse once said to me without realizing how much it would stay. We were walking back from the pharmacy, and I said something half-joking about feeling like a burden. She stopped, turned, and said very simply, "You're not heavy. You're just here." It undid me all those years I'd been weighed down by my own presence, apologizing with every step, every request, every moment of illness, every blink of confusion I wasn't even sure was real. Trying to make myself easier to carry, quieter to ignore. But now I know I was never too much. They were just unwilling to hold what didn't serve them, so I stopped asking. The weight fell off me like old wool. And in its place, light. This new life, this apartment, these walks, these simple days is not glamorous. No one writes songs about late life survival, about filing paperwork and eating toast alone and choosing silence over family dinners that erase you. But I do. I write it in my notebook every day. The real story of a woman who wasn't rescued, who didn't shatter her world in one dramatic exit, but who instead stood up quietly, turned the knob, and walked out, who chose the truth over comfort, who chose herself. Finally, after a lifetime of choosing everyone else, and that choice did not make me cruel, it made me whole. Last week, I visited a local library. I sat in the reading room for nearly an hour, thumbing through an old gardening book. There was a quote inside it, handwritten in pencil on the inside cover. I don't know who wrote it or when, but I copied it into my notebook that night. It said, "Some roots do better in broken ground." I read it over and over. I whispered it out loud as I watered my rosemary. And I thought, yes, that is me. Not wilted. Not lost, replanted. The nurse still visits once a week, though now it's just as a friend. We sit on the balcony and talk about nothing. She brings fresh bread sometimes. I make tea. We laugh. That laugh is something I didn't hear for so long. I almost forgot it belonged to me. Sometimes I wonder if people know what healing sounds like. For me, it sounds like the clink of my spoon in a cup I chose. The sound of the door when it opens and no one is afraid. The rustle of a letter addressed to me. My full name. No care of, no proxy, no third party in sight. It sounds like being addressed directly, like mattering in your own right. That's the sound I fall asleep to now, and in the morning. I wake not with dread, but with purpose, even if that purpose is only to water a plant. Read a few pages, call Ruth to ask a question I already know the answer to. I do it because I can, because no one is watching, because no one is telling me it's time to rest when all I want is to begin. And so Hey, I begin. Every day I begin again in a room I chose. In a life I built again from ashes they didn't even see as worth sweeping. And I don't need applause for. That I just need the sun to rise, and it does. Every day it does. She said it like a fact, not a cruelty. You'll die alone. As if she was forecasting the weather, something inevitable, something no one could help. I don't think she meant it to hurt as much as it did, but it did. And what she didn't know then, what I didn't even know yet, was that the sentence wouldn't end me, it would begin me, because I didn't die. I woke up, and not alone, not then, not now, in this quiet apartment. I've come to know the kind of solitude that heals, not haunts. I've grown comfortable in my own company, in the creak of the floorboards, in the soft hum of the kettle, in the space between each breath, where no one interrupts or rewrites or redirects. The walls here hold only my voice. No manipulation. No polite gaslighting and soft voices that say we're just trying to help. No glances across the table as if I weren't in the room, as if my presence were too much and not enough at once. Here, no one screens my calls. No one intercepts my mail. No one decides what I should know. Here, I am known. Here I am, enough. I never imagined this chapter of my life would begin like this. Late, a little bruised, but wide open. I thought, like many women, that the last third would be quiet, in the wrong way dimmed. Tucked behind someone else's needs, marked by waiting. Waiting for visitors. Waiting for phone calls. Waiting for permission. But no, I've written my own third act. And in it, I don't wait. I walk. I choose. I sign my name. I leave rooms that hurt. I lock doors behind me, not to punish, but to protect what I've finally gathered back. And I did it without shouting, without vengeance, without turning cold. I simply removed myself from the place where my love was used, against me. That's all. It's been months since I left the house. I paid for the one where I was asked to be grateful for being taken care of, while my voice was being quietly erased from the table. And in these months, I've learned that you don't need a crowd to reclaim yourself. Just a choice. Just a moment when you say, enough of the false kindness. Enough of being rewritten. Enough of shrinking now. Every evening, I sit at my little pine table by the window with a cup of tea and the notebook the nurse gave me, and I write small things. What I saw on my walk. It's the feel of sunlight on my arm. A memory I'm not afraid to keep anymore. Some days, I write just one sentence. Today. I belonged only to myself, and I cannot describe the freedom in that. I've stopped explaining my choices. I no longer justify why I left or what they did, or whether it was really that bad, because it was. Because even if it wasn't loud or violent or public, it was erasure. And erasure, when done gently, is still erasure. It makes you question your mind, your memories, your value. But no one questions me now. Not anymore. The nurse visits often, always unannounced, but never unwelcome. She brings fruit from the market, sometimes flowers. She leaves behind a warmth that lingers after she's gone, not because I need her, but because she reminds me what care feels like when it isn't layered with control. The wildflower grant was approved last week. I received the letter with trembling hands and read it twice in my chair before pressing it flat under a book. It's real now. The scholarship for older women returning to school. Women who've been told they're too late, too tired, too unqualified to start again. I started it in my mother's name and mine. And for every woman who has sat at the corner of a family table, silenced. Every woman who's been asked to be grateful while her name is being scratched out behind closed doors. Every woman who has been told she's a burden and believed it for too long. This is what I will leave behind. It's not bitterness, not silence, but something that grows. A few weeks ago, I received a letter from Anna. It was short, measured, careful. She said she hoped I was well. She said she'd heard about the scholarship. She said she didn't expect anything, just wanted me to know she'd been thinking about me. I folded the letter and placed it inside the notebook. I didn't write back. Not out of hate, but because sometimes healing means letting a person stay exactly where they left you so you can move forward without dragging the weight of who they refuse to become. I don't wish her harm, I never have. But I no longer wish her close. Some things must stay broken to keep you whole now. In this quiet hour before sleep, I light the lavender candle. I water the rosemary. I brush my fingers across the spine of the red folder that holds my name, my voice, a truth. And I say thank you to the nurse who held my hand when no one else did. To the lawyer who listened and believed. To my own steady heart that didn't give up, even when no one clapped for it. To the version of me who packed her bag with trembling hands and walked out the front door with nothing but her name. To the version of me that bloomed. Now, I'm curious about you. Have you ever experienced something like this? Let me know in the comments. If you've stayed with me until now, thank you. I'll leave you with 2 other stories I think you'll love.